Today I want to share with you 15 foods to stock up on now for your prepper pantry before prices go up or before they're out of stock. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning how to be a modern pioneer in the kitchen, consider subscribing to my channel. And don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. If at any time you want to jump ahead in this video, I'll have the chapter timestamps in the description as well as in the pinned comment covering everything that I'm going to talk about. Over the last year or more, so many of us have been concerned about the rising prices of groceries and what is the best way that we can stock our pantries so that we don't run out of food but can also stay within our grocery budgets. What I try to do and what I want to share with you today is that in order to stay a little ahead of inflation and rising prices, what I do is focus on 15 specific foods to stock in my working pantry as well as in my extended pantry, or what we nickname the prepper pantry. And the reason I focus on these 15 foods is these are foods I know that I can always make a meal out of. Now, may I always have all 15? No, because sometimes maybe they're out of my budget or sometimes maybe they're simply out of stock. But as long as I'm always focusing on the 15, I may have at least 5 or 10 of these items, and I know I can make a meal within my grocery budget and feed my family. Now, what I've prepared for you, and there's no email required, you can print out or download as many of these as you want, share them with your family and friends. And this is how we get through these difficult times, by all helping each other. But what I want to share with you is I prepared a shopping list for you, listing out the top 15 foods to stock up on now. And these are all non-perishable foods. These are foods for both your working pantry and your prepper pantry. And I just want to take a minute to talk about the working pantry and the prepper pantry, especially if those terms are new to you. The working pantry, what you access every day, and your extended or prepper pantry, where you store backup non-perishable foods that you use to restock your working pantry, are all part of what I like to call the Four Corners Pantry system. The first corner is your working pantry, what you access every day, as I mentioned before. The second part of your Four Corners Pantry, or the second corner, is your refrigerator. The third corner is your freezer, and the fourth corner is your extended or prepper pantry, and that makes up your Four Corners Pantry. Today I really want to focus on our working pantry and primarily stocking up our prepper pantry so that we can stay a little bit ahead of rising prices and try to shop the sales and shop the bargains and shop the clearance aisles and so on and so forth, so that we've got some backup food to restock our working pantry so that we're not always having to run out to the grocery store and maybe pay top dollar for what we need. But while we are on the topic of mentioning the Four Corners Pantry, I also want to share with you, and this too is no email required, you can download as much as you want, print it out, share with family and friends, whatever the case may be. I have something here that I call How to Keep a Well-Stocked Four Corners Pantry. And basically what I've done here, and I print out, you can print out or read online how to use this system, so to speak, that I've set up here. But the most important part of this is that I have 4 inventory lists. I have one for you to use for your working pantry. I have another to use for your refrigerator. I bet you can guess what the third one is, your freezer. One for your freezer, and they're all slightly different depending on the types of things we store in the different parts of our Four Corners Pantry. And then finally, the last one is for doing an inventory of your Prepper Pantry. And this is very important, that you get into the habit, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we shop for these 15 foods. When you go to the grocery store, having in your mind a good shopping list and some idea of what you have in your Four Corners Pantry can help you from overspending. So doing an inventory and definitely keeping an eye open for what's on sale or what's in season. Those things may not be specifically on your grocery list, but you always want to take advantage of bargains. But the bottom line is doing an inventory, and I recommend that you try to do this once a month. Just look through what you have, try to make some pantry meals, try to use up things as they get closer to their best use by date. Now, yes, do things stay in good condition and so on and so forth? It's still eatable, if that's a word, past their best used by date? Definitely. And some things better than others. I know some of you have shared with me that you find that canned goods can, depending on what the can is lined with, can sometimes take on, a little bit of a metallic taste. I understand that completely. I do like to rotate fairly quickly through my canned goods. However, the U.S. Department of Agriculture here in the United States says that most non-perishable goods really don't go bad. They just go stale or may take an off flavor, may be reduced a little bit in nutrition, so on and so forth. But doing an inventory on a regular basis, and this is easy to do with sheets like this, and you can just write what you have, how many you have, and I've got a column here for the best by date. And so you can start keeping track of what you have in all areas of your Four Corners Pantry, including your refrigerator and freezer. But I always find really focusing on my working pantry and my prepper pantry are especially important, because those can sometimes be the places where things can get squirreled away and not used up as quickly as they should. Often in our refrigerator, although I know things can kind of get lost in the freezer, but for the most part, we're accessing and making meals a lot with what's in our fridge and our freezer. So hopefully we're cycling through that relatively well. But again, doing an inventory can help so that you don't have too many things lost in your freezer. In this video, I really want to focus on the working pantry and the prepper pantry. But before we get back to this list about stocking those 15 foods, I just want to mention that along with this package, along with the explanation on how to do an inventory and your inventory sheets, at the very end, I just have your Four Corners Pantry grocery list. And what's nice about this list is as you do your inventory and you're keeping track of how much you have, maybe you're putting 0 in the column and you know that that is definitely something you need to restock. You can start just adding those foods right here to your grocery list. And as you look through them, think to yourself, look at how many you might have, or maybe you don't have any. And maybe you find that you'd really like to, have at least 3 cans of something or 3 boxes of pasta or whatever the case may be. You can start writing in how much you plan to buy in week 1 that'll fit with your grocery budget, week 2, week 3, week 4, and you can plan it out like that based on your grocery budget. Or the other way you could do it is just simply record what you buy during week 1, and then next time you're at the grocery store, week 2, again, you can just record how much you purchased. Either way will work. I generally like to try to plan things out over a month's time to take advantage of different items that I know are going to be on sale based on flyers or based on things that are online from our grocery store, and what weeks they may be on sale or for how long they're going to be on sale, and so on and so forth. But either way you do it, based on how much you think you should buy week 1 or how much you actually wind up buying during week 1. But this will make it very handy for you to kind of keep track of what you're buying and how much. And another thing to do is if you feel there's something in your pantry and it's missing, and so as you're doing your inventory, you're like, gee, there's something that I buy, but I don't see it in my pantry, or you can't remember. Maybe if you, depending on how you organize your pantry, you see an empty space if you're very organized. It's a great time to start saving your grocery lists and your grocery receipts, and you can go back and look through your receipts and say, okay, yes, I'm completely out of X and I need to buy that, and I didn't write that down on my inventory because I didn't remember, but now I see it on my grocery receipt, and so I'm going to add that to my list. So I hope that that will help with doing an inventory, or I hope these sheets will help with doing an inventory and preparing your grocery list. Alrighty, now let's get to our 15 foods. In this list, as I said, I just have at the top there, top 15 foods to stock up now, and I've listed the 15 foods here. And then again, similar to the grocery list, what I've tried to do is put week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. And you can plan out how much of whatever it is that you want to buy in a particular week, or you can plan out your month's shopping trips, whatever works for you. But as you add to this list of the things you're buying, you can transfer that to your inventory when you get home. So then you know, okay, now I have 5 cans of X, as opposed to having 3, before your shopping trip. Also, what I really like about this list and how I find that I really go ahead and use it is by putting in how much of the items that I'm going to buy that particular week, because I may not be able to buy all 15 on one shopping trip. It may be too, as I say, buzz the budget. It may be too much expense. So what's nice is I can write for item number 1, okay, I'm going to buy 3, or item number 7, I'm going to buy 4, whatever the case may be. Then when week 2 comes, I can look and see, what did I buy week 1, and what now do I need to buy in week 2, different from what I bought in week 1. And I've just got a date up here that I'll put on here for whatever particular month I'm using this. And then I'll just print out another one the following month, and so on and so forth. And as I said, print out as many of these as you want. There's no email required. I make it very easy for you. And I just want to mention quickly, I have my kitchen journal in front of me. This is a great thing for you to start if you don't have one already, especially if you're on your journey, leaving a processed foods kitchen behind, one where you tend to buy a lot of pre-packaged or pre-prepared foods, and you're moving to creating more of a traditional foods kitchen. Your kitchen journal can be a great place for you to keep all your notes on how long it took you to ferment something, or how long it took you to get your sourdough starter going, or what was the best place in your kitchen, or anywhere in your home for that matter, where your ferment was successful, and all types of things like this. Also, this is a great place to store, as we talked earlier, your grocery receipts to help you keep track of what you do want to buy. And also, it's interesting often to look back and see how much you paid for a particular item. Is the price increasing or is it going down? That would be nice. And I have a video where I'll link to my kitchen journal that I go through my whole kitchen journal with you and how I put it together and whatnot. I just use a plain 3-ring binder, and I just put craft paper on the outside and whatnot. But I go through all of it. But it's one of those things that's very unique to every person. But I do in that video, I do share mine with you to help maybe give you a little inspiration to get started. Now on this list, as we start talking about the 15 foods that we want to start stocking up now for our Prepper Pantry, I do want to share one important thing with you that you can also use this list for. It's always very important to carve out a part of your extended or Prepper Pantry for an area that you can think of as maybe your emergency pantry, or some people will call it their survival pantry. But something like that can come in very handy if you run into a situation where maybe you have no power and no clean running water. I have another printable or downloadable for you, also no email required. I don't have it in front of me here, but I just thought about it and I wanted to share it with you. And I'll be sure to link to it below. I'll link to all of this below to make it very easy for you. But having some type of supply of food that has a very long shelf life and that you maybe keep in a box, and in that box also have what you would need to prepare that food in the event you didn't have any power and you didn't have any clean running water. And the list that I share with you is a grocery list on what to shop for, and then I have a menu plan for how to prepare that food without any power or water or fresh running water. I do talk about having bottled water on hand, how to prepare that food with a week's menu. So if you buy those foods and then you store them in a box, store them with the menu plan, then if you are in a situation like we were with no power, more or less, for about a week once, you will be able to be prepared with everything in one place with that menu plan to work through that food and prepare it under emergency circumstances. Also, another thing I want to mention, even though we hope that we can always just hunker down in place and focus on getting through an emergency situation, sometimes we do need to leave our homes. And I've also shared with you how to put together a bug out bag with real food, healthy food, and things that won't necessarily make you really thirsty if you're limited on the amount of water that you can carry and you may not have a fresh water source for a day or two. So I'll be sure to put all of that in the description as well as in the pinned comment. I know the pinned comment is easier for some of you to access so that you can really have the full gamut, not just inventory, not just shopping, but also all the things that you're going to need to be prepared, under emergency or in emergency circumstances. Alrighty. You know me, I can always get down a rabbit trail, as they say, or a rabbit hole. I'm not sure what the expression is, but I like to be very thorough and cover a lot of different scenarios for you. So now let's talk about the top 15 foods. Alrighty, well, number 1 are your baking needs. And the foods you want to think about stocking up under this category are packaged yeast, baking powder, baking soda, barley malt, and vital wheat gluten. Now, are there other foods you may need, such as cornstarch or arrowroot powder and things like that? Definitely. But what I've done is just try to focus on some basic things under these 15 categories. But definitely think about any little kind of specialty items that you might like. But for example, not every corn doesn't agree with everybody, so cornstarch may not be on your list, and you may want to have arrowroot powder or some alternative for a thickening agent or a baking agent. Now you might be saying, Mary, I never even heard of barley malt or vital wheat gluten. Those seem very out there. But the truth of the matter is, if you're running a traditional foods kitchen and you're baking whole grain breads, those are 2 ingredients that can come in very handy. Now, barley, I call it barley malt. Sometimes you may see it sold under the name, and forgive my mispronunciation if I don't say this right, diastatic malt powder. Sometimes it'll be sold under that name. That can be very helpful with creating a nice texture as well as nice browning for your breads. And for vital wheat gluten, if gluten agrees with you, that can be very good to add to your breads that you make with ancient grains like einkorn and spelt, which are lower in gluten. By adding in a little vital wheat gluten, you can get a little better rise out of them. Now, are these easy to find? They may or may not be. It really depends on your grocery store. My grocery store does sell barley malt, and they do sell vital wheat gluten, and it's sold, although there are a number of brands out there, It's generally sold at my grocery store under the Bob's Red Mill brand. And I have no connection to the company. That's just what I see at my grocery store, and I want to share that with you in case you're looking for this. If you look where the Bob's Red Mill products are sold, sometimes they're just regular, straight up in the baking department, and sometimes they're sold more in the health food aisle. But it's generally that brand that I see and that I'll buy. And if you are one to order things online, both of these can be found online. Next, item number 2. I know this isn't going to surprise you when it comes to talking about a prepper pantry, but item number 2 are beans. But what type of beans do we want to stock? Do we want to stock dried beans, or do we want to stock canned beans? My answer is actually both. Dried beans are wonderful. They store very well and they last a long time. And yes, if they're very old, they might take a little longer to cook, but I always get a big kick out of the study that it might have been out of the State University of Utah. I don't remember 100%, but they share a lot of information, their extension service, about food storage. And they're really considered experts in it. And their scientist or scientist working with them decided to do a study where they took beans that were really old, maybe like 25 years old, and they cooked them up. And yes, it took them a little longer to cook them. But then they took younger dried beans, and that would have been considered, still fresh, like maybe had been stored for maybe 6 months or something. And they cooked those up, and those did cook a little faster. And then they served them to the taste testers. And the taste testers found that they weren't really noticing a significant difference. Very slightly did they notice that the taste testers liked the fresher beans than they did the less than fresh beans. And they also found that the less than fresh beans had actually retained a lot of their nutrition, more than they expected, something like maybe around 80% of their nutrition. So their final decision on all of this was that dried beans are a pretty good thing to store. And it's just a matter of learning what is the best way to cook them if they have been stored for quite a while. And I have a video, I'll link to it for you, where I show you how to really soak beans and then go ahead and cook them. And that's just a stovetop direction. And I also have found doing them in the Instant Pot works really well. And even when they're really old, I think there's something about pressure cooking that must really help the process of improving the flavor and texture of old beans. But that's an interesting thing to note. So don't be afraid to stock up on dried beans and just store them, very efficiently. I have a video where I show you, I go over it's a very detailed video. You're not surprised hearing that from me, but I go over all the different storage options for storing all types of foods. And I'll definitely link to that. And any video I mention, I'll link to it. If I run out of space in the description, I'll be sure to put it in the pinned comment. And then I also always have a link to a corresponding blog post that goes along with this video, where I share a lot more information with you than what I can, share in the video. However, you can never go wrong. Dried beans are high in protein, and they can be made very flavorful. We love pinto beans. No surprise here in Texas, it's cooked up with some jalapenos. It's really delicious. And if you've got the makings to pull together a cornbread or some type of other bread, if cornbread doesn't agree with you, and you really have a meal, it's quite delicious. And so always make sure beans are still, we're lucky, yes, I've seen them go up in price, but overall beans are still relatively affordable. So if you can buy them in bulk, and speaking of bulk, you always want to compare, and this is something my husband was very good about doing and teaching me. You always want to compare the price per pound regardless of the size of item you're buying. Because sometimes with sales and coupons, the smaller package of any, whatever you're buying may actually be a better buy than the larger package. It's really just a matter of doing a little bit of math, which he's much better at than me, but just doing a little bit of math to calculate where you're getting your best buy. But whether you're buying your dried beans in bulk or whether you're buying them in smaller packages, just store them well, and you can put them in 5-gallon buckets, and you can put them in Mylar bags. You have a lot of options. As I said, I've got that video for you. But having dried beans on hand, you know you're always going to be able to make a meal. Now, they do involve soaking. They do involve a little preparation. And so that's why I always recommend keeping canned beans on hand as well, both in your extended pantry, your prepper pantry, and your working pantry. And the reason is, again, they make a nutritious meal, and when they're canned, they can make a quick meal for you. And canned beans are just so versatile because all you need to do is open them. You can throw them in a soup. If you have like white beans, any type of white bean, and chickpeas, also known as, my mother would call them chichi or chichidi, and also known as garbanzo beans, whatever you call them, they're the basis for making a really good hummus. And so there are different things that you can do with different types of beans, and when you have them in the can, you can have dinner on the table in no time. I share a soup with you where I literally am opening a bunch of cans and jars, throwing it into a pot, bringing it up to temp, letting it simmer for about 5 minutes or so, and then putting it on the table. And it's really just canned beans, canned corn, I think a jar of salsas, something like that. And if you want to add some protein, throw in a can of chicken. And if you think you've never liked chicken, when you throw it in kind of a spicy tortilla-style soup like that, it's very tasty. So definitely think about stocking both your dry beans and your canned beans. And I just want to mention one thing. I just want to go back to the baking items for a minute. Those are sort of your supplies. We're going to talk in a lot more detail later on about what you need to bake, your flour or your whole grain, and which is better to stock and so on and so forth. But at the beginning of this list for number 1, I have the baking needs, just all the little things that you need to have on hand when you decide you want to bake. The flour and the whole grain, that's kind of a bigger topic to discuss. Number 1 was really just all the little sort of bits and bobs, so to speak, that you need when you are going to go and bake either a yeasted bread or a quick bread. Number 3 that I have on my list are beverages. And basically the most important one of those is to make sure that I am always keeping a good supply of bottled water on hand. This really came in handy when we had those ice storms here in Texas in 2021, because we were fortunate to still have water. We didn't have heat, but we did have water. But our friends didn't have water, and they had a lot of people staying with them. So once the roads were a little clearer, they were able to drive over, and we were able to give them bottled water. So that can come in very handy if you're just trying to help friends and neighbors. But also in the event that we were without water, we would have been prepared. So I'm always very carefully inventorying my backup water supply, my bottled water supply. And that's first and foremost under beverages. Everything else is more or less icing on the cake, and if my budget allows. I've shared with you I really like the Zevia, they're stevia sweetened sodas, and so they're a nice treat from time to time. But I'm often very lucky to find those in the clearance aisle at my grocery store. I live in Central Texas, and so we have the fabulous H-E-B grocery store that so many of you who live here know how wonderful it is. And those of you who have visited have shared with me how much you love H-E-B, or when you've had to relocate, how much you miss H-E-B. And that is very true. But that's one of the first things I do is check the clearance aisle, and I see what's there. and I'll often find some of that Zevia soda. Other than that, the other thing that I do keep on hand, and I don't keep a lot of this on hand, but this is how you want to think when you're thinking about stocking your working pantry, when you're thinking about stocking your extended or prepper pantry, as well as when you're thinking about stocking your emergency pantry. And I would almost put, you're going to laugh when I tell you what this is, but I would almost put this in my somewhat of an emergency pantry item. But because we live in Texas, we are very fortunate to be able to buy Mexican Coca-Cola. And Mexican Coca-Cola is made with sugar, as opposed to high fructose corn syrup like a lot of the other Coca-Colas. Now, as a traditional foods cook, I try to just limit white sugar across the board, but I definitely prefer not to have anything made with high fructose corn syrup in my traditional foods kitchen, because it can kind of mess with our bodies. The body can't always, there's a lot of scientific research done about this, but you often have to look at who was funding the research to get a little accurate information. But sometimes the body, all that fructose sometimes can be overpowering for the body. And when it becomes from fructose to high fructose corn syrup, what I've read is that sometimes the body can have some trouble processing it, recognizing it, knowing what to do with it, and so on and so forth. However, I do like to keep a little of the Mexican Coca-Cola on hand that is sweetened with the sugar. And the reason is, from time to time, I will get a very bad headache. It's rare, which is good, but from time to time, I will get a very bad headache, like along the lines of almost a migraine. And it can make me very nauseous. And I don't know, I'd be interested to hear in the comments below if any of you experience headaches like this that really are quite severe and can make you nauseous. And often what I'll need to do in order to get it under control, and I've kind of eschewed, taking any kind of migraine medications or anything like that, because this is rare. But I have found that if I take 2 Excedrin, and again, I have no connection with any of these companies, I just share with you my particular way of doing things and the solutions that have helped me, and I hope that if any of you have this problem, it might help you too. I had a girlfriend once who, she really suffered, and I just happened to mention it off the cuff one day, and she said, I'm gonna try what you do, and she was starting to get relief, so I was very happy to hear that. But what I'll do is take 2 Excedrin. That'll really help calm the headache. Now, Excedrin, it's like aspirin and whatever the generic name for Tylenol is. It's 2 things mixed together and then some caffeine, which I guess can help open up the blood vessels in your brain and make you feel better. And then the Coca-Cola, because it has the sugar in it. Now, could I do different things? Yes, definitely. But sometimes when you wake up in the middle of the night at 2 o'clock or whatever, and you're just blinding, to see straight, could I do other things that might, calm my stomach and help my headache, maybe make coffee and whatever. But I just find that if this hits in the middle of the night, this is a very easy way to get relief. And I'll take the 2 Excedrin and the Coca-Cola, and the Coca-Cola will really help calm my stomach. And I'm sure the caffeine helps, with whatever they say, opening up the blood vessels and whatnot. However, so that I will buy. I don't have to really buy it a lot because it's rare that I get the headaches. But I always like to get like a little 4-pack, and I just keep that under my cabinet in an easy to access place so that I can find it in the middle of the night and I know that it's there. So that's kind of a little look into the window of my beverages. Everybody's going to be a little different. We don't buy a lot of juice. From time to time I might buy a little grapefruit juice. If you've heard my story about taking the liquid cod liver oil when my son was a little boy, I'd shake it up in a little grapefruit juice, give it to him, and then I'd give him a little extra grapefruit juice, we would call it the chaser, which is funny because we don't drink. And he would take the grapefruit chaser to kind of get any fishy taste out of his mouth or whatever. But so occasionally if I'm using liquid cod liver oil as opposed to the pills or the capsules, I'll buy a little grapefruit juice. But we generally don't buy a lot of juice. I worry a little bit about, the carbohydrate sugar level of just drinking straight juice. I'd rather eat the fresh fruit. So beverages is going to be a little unique for everybody, but for us, it's primarily water. Bottled water for emergencies and backup, and then I'll cycle through it, to kind of keep it fresh when I make bone broth or things like that, and then I'll restock it. We do enjoy having some carbonated water when we find that on sale. And again, that's the nice thing about working through these 15 foods to stock up on now. You can do this over the next month. That's why I've kind of done this with a 4-week schedule here. And then the following month, you can start all over again. But at least to get started, you can spend the next month, which hopefully prices will stay somewhat modulated, and you can look at what's on sale every week or what you might have a coupon for, whatever the case may be. And then hopefully at the end of the month, you've got some supply of these 15 foods. So yes, so sparkling water, if we find something on sale, it's often, in the beginning I talked about things being out of stock. Getting sparkling water, at least where we live, is not always easy. They're often, the Topo Chico is the one that's very popular here in Texas. It's often out of stock, and when it is in stock, it's often limited as to how much you can buy, which I'm fine with that. That's something I really want to mention here. This is not about hoarding. This is about stocking up with a little bit extra in your cart each week so that over time you have a well-stocked working pantry and a well-stocked prepper pantry, but you're not hoarding and you have no need to rush out when there is some sort of emergency or shortage, because you've been planning every week just by buying a few extra things. And I really want to focus on the importance of doing things like that. You don't need to buy everything, and it's okay if quantities are limited, because every week you're going to be adding little by little by little. You don't blow your budget, you're doing an inventory, you know what you have, and that's what's important. And this way, why are we doing all of this? The reason is, this way we have backup food in the event that there's bad weather and we can't get out, or there's illness and we can't get out, or maybe we've lost a job. A lot of people are being laid off right now, and so maybe we've lost a job. Maybe money is very tight. Having an emergency pantry for bad situations, emergency situations, is very good, but having your well-stocked working pantry and having your prepper pantry is what can get you through illness, bad weather, job loss, so many things. And I think we all really learned this during 2020, how important it is to have some backup food on hand to help yourself and your family, to also help your friends and to help your neighbors. This is why it's so important to think about this and to start stocking up now, but to not do it in a hoarding way where you're rushing out and buying a lot of stuff and overnight you have this big prepper pantry. First of all, that might be beyond most people's budgets. But secondly, you don't need to do that, because you're going to start now, and by the end of the month you're already going to have some nice food stocked up, and then after 2 months, 3 months, and you determine what type of supply you want. I always think it's good to have at least 2 months a backup food supply. But now, with so many people being laid off and maybe it being a little more difficult to get the job that you would like, I think there are jobs out there, but is it the job you like for the pay that you need and so on and so forth? Having a 6-month supply may be a better idea because it may take you 6 months to find the job that you want. Now, might you be working other jobs in the interim? Definitely yes. However, depending on your circumstances, having a 6-month supply of food can really be a lifesaver. I know I've heard from so many of you how when you or your spouse lost their job, and having that backup supply, having that extended or prepper pantry really was a lifesaver. And it allowed you to have money for gas, which was very high for a while. And now you kind of never know really where gas is going to go. And then during these winter months, we have to worry about heating fuel or heating bills if you heat with electricity. So there's always different areas that are pulling your money. And when money is tight, but you have backup food, you really can get through very difficult times and still eat well. So just getting back to beverages for a minute, just think about the type of beverages that you like to keep on hand, and then just start adding a little bit every week to your grocery cart. Now, also under beverages, you might be thinking, how could the lady with 2 coffee pots not be mentioning coffee? And yes, definitely, if you like coffee or tea or different things like that, you definitely want to make sure that you are stocking your coffee or your tea bags or both. Now, when it comes to coffee, I really like to buy the coffee beans and then grind them and then have that ready to make my coffee. And the reason is the coffee beans have a longer shelf life than the ground coffee. However, just like dried beans and canned beans, do I buy ground coffee too? Yes, and especially when it's on sale. And the reason is I'll go ahead and use that first, and sometimes it's just nice from a convenience standpoint if I forget to grind beans, or maybe I'm a little tired and I find when I go to my coffee bin I'm low. Having that ground coffee is definitely a nice treat. So I do stock both. Number 4 is chicken. And we're going to talk about canned chicken as well as dehydrated forms of chicken. Now, I have heard from so many people that the prices of canned chicken, and I definitely, yes, agree with you, I have seen this myself, have gone through the roof. And it's true, they really have. The canned chicken at our local grocery store, as well as what I've seen at the big box stores, like your Costco and your Sam's Club and Walmart, places like that, has doubled in price from a few years ago. So what you're going to really want to do is shop around for that. Look at the different stores, look at the size of the can, see where you can get your best buy on that. But I really like to keep a little canned chicken on hand because that is such a convenience item as well as an emergency item because it's already cooked in that can and it's a wonderful source of protein. Now, I also know some of you have told me that you just can't stand canned chicken and it tastes like tuna fish. And I understand completely. And that's why I have a recipe where I show you how to make chicken patties and I show you how to really rinse the chicken out of the can really well and how to cook it up to get rid of that sort of tuna fishy kind of flavor. And they're really quite delicious. But I do like to stock canned chicken, and I do think it's something we need to stock now because it may even go higher in price. Who knows? I mean, this has really been, canned goods in general have really jumped in price. And I think that's because so many people realize the importance now of having non-perishable foods on hand in the event of a situation like 2020 or the bad weather problem we had here in 2021, or for a multitude of other reasons. People have really started to get into the mindset of how important it is to be prepared. So by adding some canned chicken into your prepper pantry, you have a nice backup supply of protein. And that's very important, especially if you have growing children. Well, all children are growing, but children, and especially if you have teenagers, having that protein in your prepper pantry is going to serve you very well. Now, when I say dehydrated chicken, yes, you can buy chicken that I believe is freeze-dried, but that's probably going to be pretty expensive. If you have a freeze dryer and you're drying it yourself, then that's great. But I think freeze-dried chicken can be expensive, and I generally always like to focus on what can we buy at the grocery store. We don't want to have to order anything special. We don't want to have to order any fancy-dancy foods. What can we just buy at our grocery store that is relatively affordable and that is relatively shelf-stable for both our working pantry and our prepper pantry? And when it comes to chicken, of course, as we already discussed, canned chicken can really be a great food to have on hand. And the other way to look for chicken is in the form of jerky. There are a lot of varieties of chicken jerky. I guess that's what it would be called, chicken jerky out there. And that can be a really nice snack food to keep in your pantry, either one, working or your extended pantry. It can be a wonderful backup. It can be great for your emergency box of food. So definitely look for that. Now, chicken jerky is generally not inexpensive, just like any type of jerky. So that's another thing. Just like the canned chicken, you're going to want to shop around a little. You're going to want to see where you can get the best price as well as the best quality. And sometimes you might even find them if you shop at Costco or Sam's. I have found some that were relatively well priced, and they were really made with nice ingredients and not a lot of chemical additives to kind of create problems for some people. Like some I saw had no monosodium glutamate, and I know a lot of you have shared with me that doesn't agree with you, may give you a headache, whatever the case may be. So read the ingredients and see what's in your budget. And just start small. My son really enjoys jerky, so that is something that I will try to have on hand, along with, which we'll talk about more when we get to the section on meats. But I just try to shop and see, okay, what might there be some at my grocery store with a coupon, and is it well made? Or again, looking at the big box stores. So definitely when it comes to chicken and you're looking for something that's non-perishable, think of those two categories, canned and jerky. Okay, of the 15 foods, number 5 are fats. Fats supply so much nutrition for our bodies, our brains, everything. And there's something that you don't want to run out of. Now, for your refrigerator, of course, you can have butter, lard, whether you make it homemade or buy it once opened. Lard is best, kept refrigerated. But what about the best fats for keeping in our working pantry and our prepper pantry? You're going to want to look for things like ghee. You can definitely make that homemade. It's a form of clarified butter, and you really can make either or. And you can buy either or. Ghee is where the milk solids, you melt the butter, the milk solids fall to the bottom. You allow them to toast up a bit, not burn, but just toast up a bit, that give a nice flavor to the clarified butter, and then it's called ghee. It's often been used in Indian cooking, from the country of India, Indian cooking. And then clarified butter is where you melt the butter, the milk solids fall to the bottom, you remove them immediately, and so you have something that's a little more mild in flavor. You often see clarified butter used in French cooking. Both ghee and clarified butter, whether you buy them or make them homemade, both are very shelf stable. So you can leave the ghee or the clarified butter by your stove and use it as you cook and whatnot. Some people consider it a forever food. I don't know about that. I think that maybe if you've purchased it and it's sealed real well in a glass jar and you put it into your prepper pantry, maybe so. But if you make it homemade and you're just having it, in a jar by your cooktop that you're using regularly, I do think it's best to try to use it up in about a year. But another wonderful shelf-stable fat is coconut oil. And you can open your coconut oil, you can keep that in your working pantry, you can keep backup in your prepper pantry. It has a very long shelf life, and it's wonderful to use in cooking, on your stovetop, sauteing, whatever the case may be. And it's also wonderful for baking. So if you're out of butter but you want to do baking, you've got your coconut oil. I use coconut oil a lot in baking. I like it better for baking than I do for sauteing. It's just a flavor thing because I like to use a very unrefined coconut oil, which I recommend. I think it's best to buy fats in their most unrefined form. And so I like to have the unrefined coconut oil, so it does have a little bit of a mild coconut flavor, but I really don't notice it in baking. And I find that it holds up beautifully. So that's something I always like to have in my pantry, as well as a backup supply of coconut oil in my prepper pantry. Next, although it is shelf stable, it generally doesn't have as long a shelf life as coconut oil, but I do like to always make sure I have a good supply of olive oil. And I will keep one bottle opened in my prepper pantry and then another bottle either in my extended pantry, or if I have room, I'll often try to put one in. I know we're talking about the prepper pantry today, but if I've got room, I'll try to sneak one into my freezer so that I have a nice ongoing supply of fresh olive oil. And I do like to buy the extra virgin olive oil. I both use it in salad dressing, and yes, I do cook with it. Generally on the stovetop, I'm really not going to be heating anything to over 350 degrees Fahrenheit, so I'm always happy to use a really high quality olive oil in my cooking. And that that probably doesn't come as a surprise to you, because those of you who know me know I have Italian heritage in my background. But when it comes to looking for these foods, I have found, or these fats specifically, ghee and clarified butter can be a little more on the pricey side. And so I think that it really makes sense to make those homemade. And especially if you can find some butter on sale, that can work very well. Coconut oil, I think some of the prices at the big box stores like Sam's Club and Costco has just been fantastic, and I really feel you can't beat it. But I've even noticed at my grocery store the prices for coconut oil have been quite good in smaller containers. So keep an eye open for that. I think that's definitely something that you can add to your list. If you like it and you tolerate it well, it's definitely a fat that you want to keep on hand. Olive oil can be a little more pricey. We're lucky here in Texas. We have what's called olive ranches. We have one right in the town over. So we can actually buy local olive oil. But I have seen some great prices on organic extra virgin olive oil at stores like Aldi's and Walmart. So definitely keep your eye open for that. But these are all good, nutritious fats. The ghee and clarified butter, based on butter. Coconut oil, very high in lots of vitamins and minerals and all kinds of nutrients. You really can't go wrong with that. And of course, olive oil is very flavorful as well as good for us. Now, what about tallow? You can certainly buy tallow, which is rendered beef suet, but you can also render your own if you can find beef suet. Suet is from around the organs of the cow. And what differentiates that from fat that you might cut off from a steak or something like that is that suet has a very mild aroma. So that when you render that, the tallow, it's called tallow once it's rendered, also has a very mild aroma as opposed to a strong beefy aroma. And that makes it excellent for deep frying. It has a very high smoke point. So if you can find some beef suet, and you have to find a trustworthy source, and you need to make sure that you're actually getting suet. And you'll be able to tell, because if you render what you think is suet and you wind up with tallow that's still kind of at room temperature, is quite soft and smells very beefy, you didn't have suet. Tallow is going to be hard at room temperature. It's going to have a relatively mild aroma, and it's going to have a very long shelf-stable shelf life that you can keep that out near your cooktop. You can keep that in your pantry. It doesn't need to be refrigerated. It does very well at room temperature, and it's very hard. It's very solid. Now, if you're working on a roast or some steaks and you're cutting off some of the beef fat, can you save that and render it? Definitely. It's not going to be tallow, although sometimes people will use the terminology interchangeably. What you simply have is rendered beef fat. And you can leave that at room temperature for a little while, but I really do feel in the long run it's better to refrigerate that, and it's better to use when you're making something where you don't mind the beef flavor. But I have a video where I show you how to render your suet, your own suet, to make tallow. I also have a video where I show you how to render pork fat to make lard. I really like to render leaf pork fat for leaf lard, because like suet, that leaf fat is from around the organs of the pig, the kidneys specifically, I believe, and that has a very mild aroma. It doesn't smell like bacon and pork, things like that. And that's really prized by bakers because it makes very light and flaky pie crusts and things like that. And it's definitely much better to use than solid shortenings that are highly processed. But you know, in my humble opinion, I always think lard should be refrigerated. But I'd be interested in hearing what you all think, if you refrigerate your lard or if you leave it out at room temperature. But tallow is a wonderful fat to have on hand, and especially if you like to deep fry. Alrighty, let's talk about number 6, fish. Fish can be purchased in so many different ways in a shelf-stable form. You can find anchovies in a bottle or a can. You can find a wide variety of canned fish, and you can also find fish dehydrated. You can also often find it in the dehydrated form at ethnic grocery stores, especially in our area. I've seen all types of dehydrated fish at Asian grocery stores. Now, I've shared with you I was raised eating sardines, so I love having canned sardines as a backup in my extended pantry, but we've also got it in the working pantry. And I have a recipe where I show you how to make sardines that's very tasty. And I know I've told you this before, but I always get so pleased when I read comments from people who say, "Oh my gosh, Mary, I thought I hated sardines." And then I said, but I'm going to trust Mary. I'm just going to give her recipe a try, and I'm going to see how it goes. And then you write me back and you say, "Oh my gosh, I love it. I didn't realize I love sardines." So I think that when you're looking at different types of fish to purchase in a non-perishable form for your prepper pantry, definitely consider trying some of these things that may be unique or unusual to you, but try them. And you know, I've got recipes for you. A lot of people have recipes for canned fish because it can often be a real bargain item. Something that we love are kippers, which is like a smoked herring. And it's scrumptious. It's amazing, though. We used to pay 99 cents a can. Now they're $1.98 a can. So all of this is going up. But it's still very reasonably priced, and you can make a wonderful meal with kippers. And so I highly recommend them. Just buy one can and just try it and see what you think. We often have had very simple meals, my husband and I, of some rice that's been cooked in bone broth with a little sprinkle of a real natural, naturally fermented soy sauce, and some smoked kippers on the side, maybe some pickled, fermented vegetables. And that's a wonderful meal. And it's a very affordable meal. So definitely think about looking at the different canned fishes that are available, not just your tuna fish and not just your canned salmon. Canned salmon has gone up in price, although I have found sometimes that it can be quite affordable if you have an Aldi's near you, and they've got some wild-caught salmon in the can, and it is less expensive. The cans are about the same size. It is less expensive than what my grocery store sells. And salmon patties are so easy to make. I have a recipe for that for you, but so many people do. And you can just search on the internet and find lots of recipes for how to make salmon patties using canned salmon, and it's very nutritious and very tasty. So these are all the things you want to start thinking about. And I have to tell you, I'll share a story with you because I know that it's not always easy sometimes when budgets are very tight. And you have to think sometimes about how you're going to make do, more or less, with the grocery budget that you have to work with. And that can often be stressful. I understand completely. But it can also be a good time to think about looking for options of foods that can serve as a substitute for fresh foods that you're used to eating, or can serve as a substitute for foods that are simply out of stock. And so you need to find alternatives. And this is something that I have really learned from my mom. And I've shared this with you before. I've shared the story with you before, but in case you're new here, welcome. But in case you're new here, I'd like to share this story with you because I think it's very important to be very open-minded when we go through difficult times, when food is expensive like it is right now. And sometimes there are shortages. There's both price and quantity to think about. And I think that when we go through times like this, we need to be very open-minded about trying different things. And I am sympathetic with young children or teenagers, even husbands. It may be difficult to introduce foods that they're not accustomed to eating. But they may be the foods that you can fit in your budget during a certain period of your life. And that's why it's so important. And I really enjoy these things that we all do from time to time, the various pantry challenges. And we share how to make not just nutritious meals and not just foods that we're using up in our pantry, but how to make them delicious. And that we can learn so much from each other. I love Jessica. I don't know Jessica, but I love her over at Three Rivers Homestead. And she is right now hosting a pantry challenge during the month of January and February. And I loved the way I watched her video about it, and I loved her presentation because when she said, okay, now we're going to talk about the rules, and she was very cute, and she said there are no rules. And I think that is what we all need to think about, not being rigid with ourselves, but just doing the best that we can. Try to use foods when whatever the case may be, illness, weather, job loss, whatever the case may be, really looking to our pantries and seeing how can we make something that's tasty and that our family will be happy to receive. And as I said, I will share with you that my mother is 98 years old. She's amazing. And she lived, along with my dad, through the Great Depression, as well as talk about food shortages, during the Great Depression, and also lived through the rationing of World War II, as well as, along with me, the gas lines and food shortages of the 1970s. So she's had a lot of experience with all of this under her belt. And she shared a story with me that I thought was so cute, but at the same time so telling about how we all need to be thinking when we are stocking our pantries with non-perishable foods, when things may be expensive or out of stock. And so I want to share the story with you that my mother has told me a number of times. And I think that it really helps give us understanding to being open to trying new types of food and how we may actually be surprised that they're quite delicious. Even though we may have not had them before, or even though our palate may not be familiar with them. As I shared, my mother lived during the Great Depression of the 1930s here in the United States. And she was a girl at this time living with her mother and father and her sisters. And food was not always so readily available, as you can imagine, during a depression. And so my grandmother often had to accept the selection that was available to her. And often, being an Italian immigrant, some of the foods were not common to her, and some of the foods she had never even cooked before. One such food that she was able to purchase during the Depression was what was called, and I think most of us are familiar with this today, but this was new to my grandmother, were navy beans. And so she wasn't 100% sure what to do with them. Now, she knew how to cook beans, and she figured she could soak them and just serve them as is, or she could make a soup, or whatever the case may be. It wasn't the end of the world, and she was happy to have the food. But she talked to her American neighbors about these navy beans, and they said, "Oh yes, you make baked beans." And my grandmother said, "Baked beans? How do you make baked beans?" And so they shared with her that you would cook up some onions and add in molasses and some spices, whatever the case may be, and then you bake them, and they're really delicious. So she was very intrigued by this, and molasses apparently for her was easy to come by. And so she made these baked beans. So when my grandmother served these in a bowl, my mom and her sisters looked at the beans floating in brown liquid, and they were, as my mother would say, almost a little afraid of tasting them. They had no idea what their mother had made. And I find it so cute because my mother was probably, I'm not exactly sure at what point, the Depression in the United States here lasted about 10 years. So I'm not exactly sure at what point these baked beans were introduced. I forget what my mother had said, but I think she was more on the side of a little girl than an older girl. She wasn't probably a teenager. And her and her sisters are looking at this, and, they're probably making a little bit of a face, what is this? But they were hungry, and that was it, that was what my grandmother had, to the supply of food she had to make. So they take their spoon and they taste like this. My mother telling it is cute because she's at her age too. It's cute to see her make the face, as if she were a little girl. But they put the spoon up to their mouth and they take a little taste. And they find, wow, this is really tasty. And of course, they finish their bowl of baked beans, and baked beans becomes more of a regular dish in their household. And my mother went on to make some of the best baked beans I've ever had. And so throughout my life, and even, as a grown woman, when I would come home, my mother would bake beans. She had a special little pot that she used. And my father loved baked beans, So I think most people do. They're very tasty. So, but what I find interesting about this is sometimes when you mention to people to try different types of food, whether it may be canned chicken or sardines, there's the face, even amongst adults, like, oh, I don't know, it doesn't sound very appetizing. But you'd be amazed at how when you look at recipes that people share, and today, I mean, there's a plethora of recipes out there for so many things. If you look at the recipes that people share, and especially if they're recipes using those foods in a way that maybe traditional cultures have used them for a long time, so they're sort of tried and true, tested, so to speak, and you make it and you serve it, sometimes you and your family, your friends, whomever you're feeding, can be very surprised at how something that they thought they may not like is actually quite delicious. And something I want to mention about all of this when you're buying shelf-stable food for your working pantry and your prepper pantry, you're often buying food that's like in something that I would definitely recommend, when it comes to running a traditional foods kitchen. You're not buying everything pre-prepared and pre-packaged and all of that. You're buying the whole foods, in essence, not the store, but the foods. You're buying the dried beans or the canned beans or whatever the case may be, the canned chicken, the canned fish. You're not buying them in a way that they have been prepared. But you then are going to take them and prepare them, hopefully using maybe a tried and true traditional recipe to make something that you're going to be surprised at is actually very tasty. And then you may find that, not unlike my mom, who found that baked beans were very delicious, you may find you really like kippers and rice, and you really like sardines when they're all chopped up with a lot of herbs and spices and served as a dip. That's kind of basically the recipe that I share with you. That how nice to discover these things. Now, of course, maybe sometimes there are going to be things that you don't enjoy, but you're just going to have bought one can or one package or one of whatever the case may be, and at least tried it. And then what's nice is that because the way you may be preparing these foods, using traditional recipes, traditional food is often relatively reasonable to make. In Italy, you often hear the terminology, cucina povera, which it translates kind of as like the poor kitchen or the cooking of the poor, something like that. But that doesn't mean that it's not delicious and that it's not wonderful. And even, it's funny, there's so much out there under the cucina povera. Every culture has this and has a term for it. It's home cooking. There's so much under the home cooking, the traditional foods home cooking umbrella, that is very easy to make, that is very tasty, that makes use of reasonably priced foods, and that also is very nutritious and delicious. This is a little unrelated to non-perishable foods, but along those same lines, I just want to share a cute story with you that I had actually shared with my father. I want to share his reaction with you. But when I first started making bone broth, but this is back in the day when sometimes the butcher would just give you the bones free, or they were very reasonable, then it became very popular. But my father, like my mother, lived during the Depression. My father was a lot poorer than my mother, although both were poor, but my mother lived in the suburbs and my father lived in the city, and they were very poor. And sometimes my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, she had very little. And often the butcher would, smile kindly on her and just give her a few bones, basically hardly any meat on them and nothing. But she would take those home and she would simmer them up, and maybe she'd have a little vegetable or something and she'd put that in, and she would serve this to her 6 children. And I was telling my father that bone broth had become very popular. And he said, bone broth, what do you mean? I said, they take the bones and they simmer them, and then they drink the liquid. And he's like, oh my gosh, that's like what my mother used to make during the Depression. And he got such a kick out of it. And I said, yes, and it's very popular again, But now bone broth is very expensive, and I saw a jar at our local grocery store and it was $12. Well, my father couldn't stop laughing. He said, "Oh, for heaven's sakes, the food of the poor has become all shishi." And so I always remember that story. But often when you learn about traditional cultures and how they prepared food and what they used to prepare their food and how nothing was wasted, you will realize that some of these foods are now served at some of the most fancy restaurants for completely ridiculous prices. One example is bone marrow. Now, you can buy the little marrow bones. They're still relatively reasonable. And I have a video where I show you how to roast them up. They're delicious. If you like steak and you like butter and you roast up some marrow bones, that's what it tastes like, steak butter. And you put that on some little crostini. Oh my gosh, it's so delicious. But even more so, it's very nutritious. It's loaded with vitamins, minerals, nutrients, collagen, everything you need. Bone marrow is one of the most nutrient-dense foods you can eat. But this was something that traditional cultures have been eating for years because they didn't waste anything. But if you look online, and maybe you go to some fancy restaurant, you look at their menu online and see if they're serving on their menu bone marrow, and it'll be very expensive. So know that a lot of these foods that you may be experimenting with, and I realize these are perishable foods, but it's just to show you that whatever traditional foods, whatever basic foods you're working with, were probably eaten by traditional cultures and were probably prepared in a traditional way to not only maximize their absorbable nutrition, to also maximize their flavor, because that's all they had. And I think all of us throughout the centuries have wanted, as human beings, to be able to enjoy our food, even if it's small, even if it seems meager, but that it's tasty as well as nutritious. So have an open mind when this is a long way to share about having an open mind, but have an open mind when it comes to shopping for different types of canned fish, and then try to find traditional recipes online for how to prepare them. I often think that if you can find traditional recipes, and Nourishing Traditions by Sally Fallon is a wonderful resource. I have a lot of traditional recipes, but that book really has a lot of recipes. It's like 700 pages long. When you find recipes for preparing whole foods, basic whole foods in traditional ways, those are tried and true recipes. They've been tested. They've been enjoyed by traditional cultures for centuries. So you know that they're going to be flavorful. Now, may your palate maybe have never been exposed to it. May your palate not immediately recognize the flavors, or even maybe immediately say, "Oh yeah, that's the best food I ever had." Maybe not. But I think that you will say, especially today, so many people love to try ethnic restaurants and ethnic foods. They're traditional foods. And you might try it and say, this is interesting. Try it a few more times. And over time, just like with sourdough bread, I always say, start with a very mild sourdough bread and work your way up, in terms of extending the fermentation time. Because over time, our palates become adjusted to these foods. And they're better for us. They're more nutritious. And so just keep an open mind when shopping for canned fish for your pantry. Number 7 is fruit. Now, this is a very common thing, and this is an easy thing to buy as well as to store, as well as to serve. I think everybody can enjoy some fruit. And today you can buy fruit in the can, or you can also buy it in bottles. I know a lot of you have shared with me that you're starting to prefer foods that are packaged in bottles. And you're seeing more peaches and pears and things like that that are stocked in bottles. And so you can actually see the fruit, and you don't have to worry as much as things taking on a metallic flavor from certain types of cans. And you can also home can fruit. And if you're new to canning, you can water bath fruit as part of your home canning. And so all you need to do is to make sure that you raise the acidity level. And that's often done with some lemon juice, something like that. But I have a video where I show you how to home can pears. It's very easy to do and they're very tasty. And so definitely think about adding that to your extended pantry. Home canned foods are always great to have on hand, and learning to home can, starting with water bath canning, is a little easier than pressure canning because you don't need a particular water bath vessel. If you have a water bath canner, great, but you can also just use a big stock pot and put like if you have a little baking rack or something that you can put down on the bottom that the jars can sit on, that'll work fine too. All you really need then are the canning supplies, the cans, obviously, and the lids and the bands, and some people call them rings, so on and so forth. And that's it. And so you can start home canning your own fruit if you get a windfall. Maybe you've got some fruit trees and you get a windfall from them, or maybe you get a really good buy on a couple of cases of fresh fruit at the farmer's market, or even sometimes at your grocery store. So those are all things to keep an eye out for, both bottled and canned fruit, whether cans that you buy at the store or fruit that you home can. Now, also, one of the best ways to buy fruit in terms of for storage is dried fruit. And the nice thing is most dried fruit is very easy to come by and very economical. You can buy raisins, you can buy currants, you can buy figs and prunes, the cherries. The list really becomes endless. I really like to keep dried currants on hand because I love using those in quick breads as opposed to larger raisins. But you just go down the dried fruit aisle in your grocery store and you'll see a wide variety of dried fruits to pick, and that you can stock both in your working pantry as snacks and your prepper pantry to back up your working pantry. Also, it really depends because a lot changed during 2020, but a lot of grocery stores will sell dried fruit in their bulk section if they still have their bulk section. And I think grocery stores may be starting to bring that back if they completely eliminated it during 2020 and 2021. But you can often get a fairly good buy when there isn't that extra packaging and you're just buying your dried fruit in bulk. So think about that. And one thing I want to share you, speaking about my mom, she always stewed dried fruit. She stewed fresh fruit. She was a big believer that eating foods that were gently cooked was easier to digest than if they were raw. But she would take dried fruits, she'd take some fresh fruits, maybe like say apples, and she would cut those up and put in a little water and bring it up to a simmer and just cook them a little bit to soften them. But she might also add in with that maybe some chopped prunes or maybe some raisins or some currants, whatever she had on hand in her pantry. And sometimes she would just stew the dried fruit all by itself. And it was a wonderful topping for cereals. And it was a wonderful topping for ice cream to maybe dress it up a little. So there's a lot that you can do with dried fruit. And there's a lot you can do with it when you take it one more step and stew it just by putting it in a little bit of water, bringing it up to a simmer on your stovetop, letting it simmer for a little bit to just kind of become soft and flavorful. And it's quite delightful. So that's the other thing you always want to be thinking about. How can I use these foods in different ways? How can I make the most of what I have in my pantry and in different preparations, yet at the same time flavorful and yet diverse enough so that no one's becoming bored. Oh, we just have raisins to snack on, nature's candy, gee, thanks, I remember hearing kids say that, when it became popular to give little boxes of raisins, at Halloween. This is like maybe like in the 90s or something when people were trying to be more healthful or whatever the case may be. But you can certainly have the raisins for snacking, but always keep in mind that, dried apricots, they are wonderful. I love to chop them up and add them into couscous and with some chopped nuts and make kind of a wonderful couscous that's very flavorful and has a lot of texture and a little sweetness, a little savory. I'll use bone broth or other type of broth instead of water. So that's what you always want to be thinking. Okay, I'm buying these foods, I'm stocking these foods, and what are creative ways in which I can use them? And dried fruit really affords you a lot of options, both sweet and savory. Also included in category or number 7 are vegetables. And you have a lot of options when it comes to purchasing and then storing shelf-stable vegetables. You have your traditional canned vegetables. You can also find them in glass jars today. And of course, you can also store dehydrated vegetables. But now when it comes to dehydrated vegetables, you don't have to buy anything special. Those can actually be rather expensive. I share with you a very simple way to dehydrate your own vegetables and making it easy as well by starting with frozen vegetables. So now you can clear out room in your freezer and make your frozen vegetables shelf stable by dehydrating them. Now, this works best if you have an electric dehydrator. However, this time of year, after Christmas, a lot of people are dumping these, sadly but true, at your various thrift shops. So keep your eyes open for one if you'd rather not have to buy it new. Next on my list, number 8, is meat. And this again, bottled, canned, dehydrated. This is very similar to number 4 that we talked about earlier with chicken. Meat, and yes, meat, whether it's fresh or pantry stable, shelf stable, is become quite expensive. There's no getting around it. But the bottled meat that I'm talking about is chipped beef. And I still see that. That's a very old-fashioned food. And I still see that in my grocery store. And it's sold in a bottle. And you can warm that up. And there's the dish known as chipped beef and toast. It's delicious. I grew up having that. And you just soften that chipped beef and you put that, as the name implies, on top of toast, and there's a little gravy that you make to put on top of it, and it's lovely. That's a great food to keep on hand, and that, I find, is still affordable. The canned meat, just like the canned chicken, not only has gone up in price significantly, it is also difficult to find. But for that reason, I recommend, and I don't really think it's going to be coming down in price, so I think if you can find it, it's worth at least trying to stock up with a few cans, because that can be a nice backup if you don't have any fresh meat, or if the fresh meat has just, gone through the roof in terms of price. Even pork is becoming so expensive, it's shocking to me. But I think just if you can shop around, as I said with the canned chicken, compare prices at your local grocery store, maybe some of the big box stores if you have access to that, and then think about just adding a few cans to your shopping cart. And of course, like with chicken and meat, depending on what you have access to and you know how to pressure can, those are things that you can home can as well, and can often be very affordable and last you over a year or 18 months, depending on, if you're raising the animal yourself, if you're getting a very good buy on something from a local rancher or something like that, and then you can pressure can it. And canning lids will generally say, the food that you've pressured canned with the canning lids will stay fresh for a year or 18 months. That's kind of the official rule. But I know a lot of people who pressure can who think, and will say that their food stays fresher than that. So that's definitely something if you're interested in. If you're interested in, definitely search out some books on your library or on the internet about pressure canning. And then dehydrated, just like with the chicken. look at the prices of jerky and see what you can find at a relatively good price if that's something that you want to stock. And then just keep that on hand. It has a very long shelf life, which is good. And you can have some for snacks. As I shared with you, my son really likes jerky, both chicken and beef jerky. And so I like to have a little bit of a backup supply for that when he comes to visit us. But the bottom line is you have options. You can look for some of these chip beefs that are in the bottle. You can look at the canned meats. And then you can also consider some jerky and, meat in a dried form. So moving on, number 9 are milk products. So let's take a minute to talk about milk, because it's easy to run out of fresh milk. So what do we do in terms of stocking milk in our pantries? And what do we do about having a good supply in our extended or prepper pantry? And how do we keep it fresh? These are all, great things to be thinking about. Yes, powdered milk can come in very handy. Is it perfect? No. Is it a little damaged? Some more than others, yes, during the drying process, depending on how high the heat that's been used to dry it. However, can we increase the nutrition of it? Yes. You can take powdered milk, you can add water to it, reconstitute it, and then culture it a little bit with yogurt and make homemade yogurt out of it. And so at least you're introducing some good bacteria that may have been destroyed during the heating process. I also say doing this with fresh milk if all you can find is ultra-pasteurized milk. But let's focus on what type of powdered milks we're talking about. Powdered milk that says on the package is non-fat powdered milk is going to have the longest shelf life. Is it my first choice? No, because the fat has been removed. And when you think of traditional foods, you really like to think of them intact. However, if you're looking for something that does have a long shelf life and is unlikely to go rancid, then non-fat powdered milk is an excellent option. Powdered milk that still has the fat intact is also a good option, but it's not going to have as long as a shelf life. I like to keep both, but I stay very on top of the expiration date of the powdered milk that still has the fat intact, because that can go rancid. So when it comes to looking for these powdered milks, at your grocery store, chances are they may have 1 or 2 brands, and they're going to be the non-fat option. And if possible, when you look at the packaging, if it says low temp dried, all the better, even though it's non-fat. Low temp dried powder milk will have a little more nutrients in place than high temp dried milk. But I will be honest with you, most of what I have found at my grocery store is just your typical non-fat dried milk powder. Chances are it's high temp dried, but I'm not going to worry about that as a backup. That's almost what I would consider an emergency or a survival food, because if for the most part, if you tolerate dairy and you want to buy fresh dairy, it's usually relatively easy to come by. But if for some reason you can't get out and you run out of fresh milk, having that powdered milk, my mother always kept powdered milk on hand as a backup, especially growing up in New York with snowstorms and whatnot. She always made sure she had a backup supply of powdered milk. She could use it to make milk to drink. She could make yogurt. She could use it to bake with. It's a very versatile ingredient. And then often, if you are able to find the full fat powdered milk, and sometimes you might find this at a specialty grocery store. It's definitely available online, but you might find it at a specialty grocery store. And that type of milk, that whole milk, dried milk, is often low temp dried. So that's a nice feature if you can find it. But don't worry if you can't. Now, what if dairy, traditional dairy doesn't agree with you? That's fine. Stock what dairy, and I use the term loosely, does agree with you, and find it in shelf-stable forms to back up anything that you may buy from the refrigerated section. So if you like almond milk, or if you like oat milk, whatever, there's a big variety today of nut milks, and then coconut milk, and many of them are sealed in containers that are shelf stable. Have a few of those. Are they perfect? I mean, I would highly recommend making any of that homemade. However, in an emergency, as backups, these are good things to have, especially in your prepper pantry. You may not even have one in your working pantry because you may not rely on it. But this is why we're going to talk about, as we talked about earlier, doing the inventory so that you know what you have in your prepper pantry. So if for any reason you're not able to get your refrigerated alternative milks, you can just rely on what you have in your prepper pantry. And then you're going to keep track of it in terms of its best use by date, and then you can use it, in place of 1 week of what you might buy from your refrigerator section. You can use it in baking, whatever the case may be. So just when you come to this section on milks, just focus on what you like and what you might buy in a perishable form, and then think, okay, what if I ran out of this in the perishable form? Could I have an alternative in my non-perishable form, whether, as I said, the working pantry or the prepper pantry? What could I have in a non-perishable form that could back me up and see me through for a week or two until I was able to get the perishable or the refrigerated form? So there's a lot to think about when it comes to milk, dairy, and dairy alternatives, but you definitely have a wide selection to meet your dietary needs. And I would recommend that if you are taking alternative milks, to really give serious consideration to reading what is in that milk and possibly calling the manufacturer and asking them how they make it. Because you've got to remember, things like oats, nuts, seeds, whatever the case may be that the milk is being made from, those foods contain anti-nutrients that can make it difficult for our bodies to assimilate important nutrients, anti-nutrients. Now, do these anti-nutrients like phytic acid also have a good side? Yes. And that's why I think it's so interesting in nature that even if you properly prepare these foods in a traditional way, you don't deactivate all the phytic acid. So in essence, you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting the anti-nutrients reduced somewhat to allow you to absorb nutrients that you need to as it goes through your digestive system. And yet there's still some of the phytic acid in place that can act as an antioxidant in your body. So there's, two sides to it. What do they say? There's always two sides to every story. So, but what happens is with these commercially prepared oat milks, nut milks, seed milks, whatever, are they preparing them properly to help deactivate some of the phytic acid, some of the anti-nutrients? If not, you may want to give serious consideration to making your own homemade, where you soak your nuts and you soak your seeds, you soak your oats, in order to deactivate some of that phytic acid before you turn them into some sort of alternative milk. And the reason is, you don't want, if you drink these alternative milks day in and day out, you don't want to drink something every single day that may be preventing you from absorbing all the nutrients you need to absorb from the food you are eating, or even worse, maybe stripping your body of some nutrients that you really need. So definitely research that. The Weston A. Price Foundation website can be a wonderful resource on learning more about this. That's the foundation that Sally Fallon, author of Nourishing Traditions, founded, and they are just a wonderful resource about all of this. But anyway, so that's number 9, your milks and your alternative milks. Number 10, nuts and nut butters. Now, nuts can be stored at room temperature. They should be stored, in a cool, dark pantry like your working pantry or your prepper pantry. And if you have one of those systems where you can suck all the air out, like the Food Saver system, all the better. Because nuts do spoil. They do go rancid. They can't stay in your pantry forever. They're always better off being stored in, like the freezer or the refrigerator. But if that's not an option, definitely limiting the amount of air and light that they're exposed to, all the better. But storing nuts is another reason why it's really important to stay on top of your inventory so that you are using those nuts before their best used by date. I forget exactly what the proper terminology is. But for the most part, most nuts, now I'm talking about nuts that have been shelled, most nuts will generally have a shelf life, outside of refrigeration or the freezer for about a year. So they've got a relatively good shelf life, but you do want to make sure that you use them up. And if at any time they do smell off-putting, chances are they've gone rancid. Another wonderful option for your prepper pantry are nut butters. Nut butters, assuming that they're sealed and not opened, will often have a shelf life of 2 years. And I'll tell you a funny story. When we had that ice storm here in Central Texas back in 2021, we didn't have any heat. And every once in a while, the power might kick on for a little bit, but then it would kick off again. We had our fireplaces going and kept our house was starting to get below 40 degrees inside. And so we were wearing our coats. And one thing that we were so happy that we had and we really enjoyed was peanut butter. And we really, we were so cute. I don't think I have a picture, but we pulled our chairs around here and we had the fireplace going here in the kitchen, and we would enjoy the peanut butter on saltine crackers, sometimes just right off the spoon. And it was really wonderful. And my husband and I laughed because after that experience, we both agreed we needed to make sure that we stocked a little more than normal the amount of peanut butter that we kept on hand. So now I always make sure that I have like a backup or two of peanut butter. But any nut butter that you like, if you don't tolerate peanuts and you want peanut butter, you want a nut butter, there's almond butter, cashew butter. My gosh, the selection I see even at my local grocery store is amazing. But what you want to do is, and this goes back to what we just talked about with the alternative milks and the soaking, nuts also contain anti-nutrients and often are better if you soak them and then allow them to dry. And you can dry them in a slow oven or your dehydrator. That helps deactivate some, not all of the anti-nutrients, but that's okay. And then store them, in some sort of airtight container to keep them as fresh as possible. And that's a very nutritious way to consume nuts. Certainly, if you are moving past the nut butters, but certainly getting back to just the fresh nuts, certainly if you're buying nuts in the shell, which you often see around, the winter months, especially around Christmas time, holiday time, you see the nuts in the shell. Those will have a longer shelf life than the nuts that have already been shelled for you. So that's something to think about. There is a little more work involved when you're ready to soak them and dry them, and that you're going to have to crack them out of their shells. But in a way, that can sometimes be helpful, especially if you decide, I'm not going to deal with that. I'm just going to eat them raw right out of the shell. And if you decide to do that, having to crack them and take them out of the shell can kind of slow you down and keep you from over-consuming them. So that's a good thing. But if you do soak them and then dry them, you can toss them with some salt and some seasonings. You can make them very flavorful. And if you decide, oh, I don't want to get involved with doing any of that, Sally Fallon in her book Nourishing Traditions, and I believe, also maybe it's on their website, the Weston A. Price Foundation website, recommends that if you don't want to go through all that process, at least look for nuts and or nut butters that have been made, that the fresh nuts have been roasted, and that the nut butters have been made from roasted nuts as opposed to raw nuts. So that's something to think about as you're going through your shopping list and looking in your grocery store what you want to consider putting into your shopping cart. Also, when it comes to nut butters, I really like to focus on those that are just nuts and some salt, preferably sea salt, all the better, and many today are made that way. But salt, nuts and salt, roasted nuts and salt, and that's it. I really try to avoid getting too many additional ingredients, especially sugar. I have seen some nut butters that are sweetened with honey. That seems nice, but for me, the first choice is always just the nuts and the salt. Now, do you have to stir them up and all? Yes. They often won't be emulsified. In order to emulsify them, they often have to add an additional fat. Sometimes they'll add palm oil, something like that. I'm not against buying something like that for convenience, but I'll usually just buy it. The oil will be on top. I'll spin it around a lot with a spoon or a knife or fork, whatever I've got, and get the oil incorporated into the peanuts, and then I'll put it right into the refrigerator. So hopefully it'll firm up and then everything stays intact. I find that works pretty well. Alrighty, number 11 is pasta. And something that I want to tell you about pasta, never be afraid about stocking pasta in your working pantry and your prepper pantry and serving it as a meal. Pasta is made from durum semolina flour. Well, durum semolina. I don't even really want to put flour on the end because I'll explain in a minute what exactly semolina is. But what's important to know is that it is not white flour. And even if you're making homemade pasta, you should not be making your pasta with all-purpose flour, white flour, plain flour, you may know it as. You should be searching out durum semolina to make your pasta in order to make it really traditional and nutritious. Okay, what is semolina? Semolina is what is referred to as the middlings. What are the middlings? The middlings are what is left over when durum flour is milled. So they're removing some bran and some germ, and then you're getting the durum flour, which is a more shelf-stable form of flour. It's because it's had the bran and the germ removed, something more similar to like an all-purpose or a bread flour, something like that. But what is left over is something called these middlings. It's got a little bit of flour, a little bit of bread, a little bit of germ, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's just a mixture of things. And these middlings are called semolina. And that's what's used to make good pasta. And semolina is very rich in nutrients. And so you don't need to worry that you're eating something that's devoid of nutrients. It's not the case at all. What's important is that when you shop for your pasta, you look and you make sure that it's made from durum semolina, and most is. So that's good news. And the good news is when you store pasta correctly, it can last a very long time in your prepper pantry. And then you can make it so nutritious because you can use it as a base in basically to add anything to. Nutritious sauces, butter-based sauces, tomato-based sauces. Add in lots of vegetables. Add in nutritious and healing herbs and spices. So there's a lot that you can do with pasta. And don't be afraid of thinking that it's not nutritious. It is, as long as it's been made from semolina. So that is something that always makes me very happy to see, because even when I look at the ingredients on the pasta, because most is made from semolina, and even those little packages, and I forget, I know you all told me how to pronounce this correctly, is it Fideo? F-I-D-E-O, the little pieces of pasta that you can put into soups. I love that, or used to make like a homemade rice-a-roni. And those are at Aldi's. They used to be like 28 cents for a 7-ounce package. I think they're like double now, but or 40 something cents. But the bottom line is I was so happy when I looked at the ingredients and saw that they were made from semolina. So don't be afraid, stock pasta. I know you're saying, well, Mary, this is a woman of Italian heritage telling us to stock pasta. That's true. But it wouldn't be my pantry if I didn't have pasta in it. And, you know, speaking of my pantry, I did a video where I decided to like reorganize my pantry. I made the mistake of trying to do it all in one day. It didn't work out, but I had everything out. Oh gosh, it was such a job. But I'm going to take you on another pantry tour in the future, because I wound up redoing it again because I made the mistake of stacking containers on top of one another, and they were kind of heavy, and I was having to like pull them down. It was just a little bit of a challenge. So I did some reorganizing, and I'll take you along for that, but you'll laugh because you're going to see all the pasta. But I just find it a wonderful vessel for a reasonably priced meal, and one that is nutritious and can be even made even more nutritious. For example, today I made a pantry meal, and I had some chopped meat in my freezer. I took it out last night and defrosted it. My grocery store had a good buy on grass-fed and grass-finished. So the cattle were never given grain, which makes their omega-3 very high. And omega-3, like what you hear a lot about that is in salmon, when the cows are just raised on grass, their meat contains a lot of omega-3 like salmon, and omega-3 is very good for our hearts and our brains and just overall health. So they had a very good buy on the grass-fed, grass-finished beef, $1 off each package. So I bought some, and what I did was and I had some, doing these pantry challenges, I'm really trying to clear everything out of my pantry, my refrigerator, I should say, out of my crisper. And I made a rule for myself, as I shared with you earlier. Jessica said, oh, no rules, you make your own rules. The rule I made for myself was that I wouldn't buy any fresh vegetables until I completely cleared out my crisper. So I had mushrooms. They were getting a little close to their prime, a little past their prime, I should say. So I browned the ground beef with the mushrooms. I browned them together because the ground beef was releasing its fat, and that gave some nice fat for the mushrooms to saute up in. Then I added some tomato sauce that I had in a bottle, and then I boiled up some rigatoni, which I got on clearance. The boxes were all smashed, but the rigatoni was fine, the type of pasta. And I had 2 boxes. I think I paid $1.27 for each box, and it was the Checo brand. It's a very nice brand. And I boiled up 2 boxes of the rigatoni, and then tossed them with the meat, mushroom, and sauce mix, put it in a baking dish. Then I scoured the little pull-out thing I have in my refrigerator where I keep cheese. And I found a few like little hardened bits and bobs of cheese. I just grated them up, and I put it on top. Oh my gosh, what a delicious meal my husband and I enjoyed. All from just things, basically using up some things in my pantry. Never turn down pasta, especially when you get it in the clearance aisle. But it's always, in all seriousness, it's a very good thing to have on hand, because you can make a very reasonable meal, but one that you can make nutritious. As a matter of fact, I have to share with you, and I have a recipe for this. I'll try to remember to link to it. I think I've got them all in a playlist. It's called Cooking with Scraps. And sometimes if you use leeks, which I really like leeks, I might just use the white part and then up to maybe the light green part, but you'll know that the big green tops are often really tough and whatnot. I will cut those really, really thin, and I'll saute them in some olive oil. You could throw in some garlic. You could get some lemon zest and lemon juice, whatever you want. Saute them all up and they will soften, and then toss them with some thin, I like to use the thin spaghetti. The other day I messed up and I wound up making angel hair. It was still good, but they were a little like heavy with the angel hair. But if you get some thin spaghetti or regular spaghetti and you toss these leeks that you've sauteed, the green parts, with the pasta, that's a delicious meal. And you've got the olive oil in there, maybe you've added some garlic, you've made, and the leek greens, which are very nutritious. And so you've added in a lot of nutrition just starting with some pasta. That is such an affordable meal because you're cooking with maybe something that you would have thrown out. Maybe you threw out the tops of those leeks, which, I always say, don't throw anything out. Cook with scraps, you can make a whole meal. Alrighty, well now let's move on to number 12. Let's talk about rice. And I've got here where I make some notes for you too to help you when you're on your shopping trip. But I really feel when it comes to stocking rice, now it's different if you got something in your working pantry and you're going to use it within 6 months, then brown rice is okay. But if you're looking for rice to stock in your prepper pantry that's going to have a long shelf life, especially when stored appropriately, you want to think about white rice. And two brands, or varieties, I should say, two varieties that are very good in terms of their, and this was something I read, and if you're worried about the glycemic index and the effect on blood sugar, I know a lot of people worry, oh, white foods, white rice, it's going to send my blood sugar through the roof. Of course you got to, talk to your doctor or your nutritionist about this, but I was reading that long grain and basmati are some of the best white rices to eat for your diet and the most shelf stable. So I thought that was very interesting. Now, rice has gone up in price. I won't lie to you. But I have found, and you will have to compare when you go shopping locally, we can buy both long grain and basmati at most of the big box stores in large bags, 25 pounds, 50 pounds. I have found the per ounce price to be less than if you buy a small bag or container of white rice at the grocery store. It's just a matter of finding it. Sometimes they're out of stock. It's just a matter of finding it in stock, and if that bulk price is in your budget. I know sometimes that can be a problem because, and I was very surprised that some of the rice, it might have been the basmati, I can't remember exactly, but it was pushing up to almost $50 a bag. And so that may not fit in your budget. And then you will want to buy the smaller containers. And then over time, just especially if you're on your journey from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, as you start to make more things homemade, make more meals at home, buy less processed foods, less prepared foods, less eating out, less fast food, less of all of those things, and you start making your meals at home, you then can start to move money around in your budget. And you can move money from the things you used to spend money on and move them into your grocery budget, which then will give you a little wiggle room if you want to buy larger packages, larger foods in bulk packages that may have a less per ounce price. So just keep that in mind. Don't worry if in the beginning, if you're at the beginning of your journey and you're saying, wow, I can't buy these things in bulk. I got to spend more money on this, that, or the other thing. Don't worry. Don't rush. Take your time. You're on a journey. I say that all the time. And know that over time, you will have a little more available monies in your grocery budget. So start looking for the long grain or the basmati rice. And I will tell you, when you're on your grocery stocking trip, I will tell you, I thought I did not like basmati rice. This goes back to talking about, what's available, what's affordable, what can you find in stock, so on and so forth. I had always been eating like long grain rice. And my husband liked a wide variety of rices. And I have to say, I just wasn't sure about it. And the basmati, I don't know, when I first made it, the aroma in the house and the texture, the way it looked, I just wasn't sure about it. But I've got to tell you, when I tried it, it was delicious. And now I love it. I make basmati a lot. So again, you know, open-minded, try different things, see what's in stock, see what's the best buy. And that's a very traditional food, and that's been made, you know, by people of the Indian culture for a very long time. So you can't go wrong with that. And what's nice about white rice, not only does it have a good shelf-stable or, you know, shelf life, you can do so much with it. In many ways, it's like pasta. But you can substitute bone broth or you know, a chicken or a beef broth, even if you don't have a bone broth, vegetable broth, whatever you want. You can substitute one of those broths in place of water when you make your rice. So you've already upped the nutrition. Then to that broth or whatever you're using, you can add some butter. You've upped the nutrition again. Also, you can add some sea salt. Now you've introduced some really good minerals. So there's so much that you can do with rice, and that's just one example in terms of making the plain rice, but really increasing the nutrition. And then whatever way you serve it, making a fried rice or just having it as a side dish with some vegetables, some fermented vegetables, all of these things, white rice and pasta can become very good vessels for introducing other foods, other nutritious foods into your diet, because you can make the rice the way I just explained, with the broth, the butter, the sea salt, then top it with some kippers, top it with some sardines that have been prepared in the way that I share with you. And it becomes this wonderful, delicious, traditional meal that is going to be surprisingly tasty to you, especially if it's something new to you. I promise you. So don't turn your nose up to white rice. It's very shelf-stable. It's wonderful to have in your prepper pantry, and you can do a lot to increase the nutrition and to also use it as a vessel to introduce other nutritious or nutrient-dense foods into your diet. Number 13 on my list is salt. Now, do you want to have the regular plain iodized salt, or do you want to have sea salt? My answer may surprise you. Just like with canned beans and dried beans, I'm going to tell you to buy both. And the reason is, you don't have to use the iodized salt on a day in and day out basis. It often has maybe some chemicals added to it, or anti-caking agents, things like that. Although I have been seeing sea salts to which additional iodine has been added. But the reason you want to have iodized salt is in the event of any kind of emergency. And that's something that, even if you have your emergency pantry, but if you're the type of person who likes to even think about having like a little survival pantry where things might be very difficult, God willing, we hope that never happens. But if you're in a situation where you're not able to get foods that contain iodine, primarily like seafood or seaweed, you will want to make sure that you have iodized salt, because that's what protects your thyroid. And this is how salt became iodized, at least here in the United States, was that as societies expanded and were in the middle of the country and weren't having foods high in iodine, they weren't living on the coasts and eating seafood, that they were developing a condition called goiter. And that's like where you might see sometimes pictures of people from past times in history, or even today in cultures where people aren't able to get enough iodine, and it'll look like they have a large mass on their neck, and that's because the thyroid is malfunctioning. And having iodine in the diet prevents goiter. So having some iodized salt on hand can be good for an emergency or a survival situation. Hopefully we'll never have that situation, but it is good to have iodized salt. And if you're just not in the habit of eating foods that contain iodine, it can be good to use a little bit of that every once in a while in your diet. However, as a general rule, I really like to use sea salt. And most of the time, yes, I use it in cooking, but then I also like to reserve a little, even if I taste the food when it's cooked and I feel it still needs a little bit of salt, I like to reserve a little because sea salt is a living food. And I like to be able to use it as a finishing salt so that we are maximizing our ability to get all of the nutrition that the sea salt, or from the sea salt, that it has to offer. And the nice thing about sea salt is it's just that, it's salt. It doesn't have any chemicals, it doesn't have any anti-caking agents. And this is the type of salt I always recommend when you're making ferments. Because as I've shared with you, I know I've said this many, many times, ferments are persnickety. And we want to do everything in our power to use ingredients that are going to give us the best chance of making successful ferments. So what does that mean? That means using a salt that doesn't contain chemicals or anti-caking agents, because these things interfere with the fermentation process. So make sure that you have some sea salt. And I know some of you have asked me, what do I think of Redmond's real salt? I think it's an excellent option. And I'll be sure to link to my shopping guide below, because I have a discount coupon code for you to use if you want to purchase Redmond sea salt. And that's always nice. Whenever we can save money, it's always great to be able to save money. Yeah, so at least have one canister of iodized salt somewhere in your prepper pantry, but on a general daily basis for cooking, fermenting, so on and so forth, be sure you are stocking some sea salt in your prepper pantry. And there's a wide variety. There's not just the Redmond sea salt. You may like the Celtic brand of sea salt. There may be a sea salt at your grocery store that you find and will be completely satisfactory. The bottom line is always look and check the ingredients and make sure that it just says salt. And sometimes you may find that if you have canning salt in your pantry, the type of salt that's used for canning, that'll say just salt, and that's perfect for using for canning, because not unlike ferments, canning also doesn't like to have a salt involved that has a lot of chemicals or anti-caking agents. Now, what about kosher salt? You need to be careful. I was so disappointed when I bought some kosher salt at, it was either Sam's or Costco or Walmart, I'm not sure where I bought it. It was one of those big, blue boxes. And I was so disappointed because I thought it would just be salt. And when I got it home, I looked and saw that it did have some additional ingredients in it. And so that was disappointing. So always just check the ingredient list. If it says salt, you're good. Moving on from salt, number 14 is sugar. Now, I say sugar, but we're going to talk about sweeteners here. But the reason I say sugar is I do want to mention that just like the iodized salt, it's probably smart to keep some white sugar on hand. And the reason is, when you're canning, if you decide you want to become a home canner, maybe you want to make jam and you want to home can it. I always recommend, but I would be very interested in hearing from all of you in the comments, because maybe you've had different experiences, but I like to use white sugar when I'm canning. And the reason is, I don't always get the results I'm looking for, and I do worry about sometimes the unrefined sugars burning during the canning process and creating an off flavor in my jam. So when it comes to making jams, jellies, whatever the case may be, I always like to keep one of those big bags. You can get them at Costco or Sam's, and I buy an organic, it is a white sugar, but it's not been bleached, and I always keep a bag of that in my prepper pantry, and then I keep some in a jar in my working pantry, because there are times when sometimes if I'm doing a little topping on, like say I'm making old-fashioned graham crackers or something like that, and I'm doing a sugar cinnamon topping, I find using the whole sweeteners can sometimes burn. And so white sugar will often work very well. Do I use a lot? No. I keep the amount that I use very limited. And I even have a recipe where I show you how to make low sugar jam. So these are things to keep in mind, and you don't, consider, what do I cook, what do I make, might I have occasion for some white sugar? Then you want to definitely think about adding that to your cart and stocking it in your prepper pantry. And just store it securely to keep the bugs out, and it's basically going to last you a very long time. Just like salt and sugar, they're considered forever foods, and you don't have to worry about them at all as long as you just store them properly. And as I said, I have a video where I go over all of that in detail. I think I'd be sitting here all day if I went into all of that. But I do have that very detailed storage video, and I'll link to that. So you can make sure that whatever you are storing in your prepper pantry is being stored correctly to extend its usefulness, its shelf life, whatever the case may be, as long as possible. The other sweeteners I want to talk about are unrefined whole cane sugar, honey, molasses, maple syrup, coconut sugar is another one. Unrefined whole cane sugar is simply the juice extracted from the sugar cane and then dehydrated. And so it has all the molasses, all the nutrients, everything is intact. And I really like that. I do keep a good supply of that on hand. And I was so surprised. My grocery, I think a lot of people are liking it. I used to see it a lot at Whole Foods and or order it online, but now I'm actually seeing it at my grocery store. The selection of sweeteners that's expanded at my grocery store is nothing short of amazing. But interestingly enough, the unrefined whole cane sugar, it just seems to always be sold out. So I always try to pick up a bag or two and put that into my shopping cart to make sure that I have at least 3 or 4 on hand, because they're not big bags. And if you can find it in a bulk form, all the better. But I don't use a ton of sugar, of that type of sugar, but I do like it for baking. And so when I do find it, I try to stock up on it a bit, and then keep that in my prepper pantry along with 1 jar in my working pantry. Honey, if you saw my video where I did show you my pantry, I have a ton of honey. I love honey. And my husband's cousin raises bees, and he's given us some honey in the past too, which is nice. But I really like honey. It's very nutritious. It's very soothing. If you are plagued in the middle of the night with a bad case of indigestion and you take a teaspoon of honey, it can really tamp it down. It's very soothing. And in tea, when you're sick for a sore throat, it's just such a multi-purpose sweetener and a nutritious one. And I'll make you laugh, but things that I saw my mother do that I didn't really focus on a lot when I was younger, but now with her being 98, I really give them credence. I say, that must be something good. My mother always had a jar of honey on the counter, and whenever she wanted a feeling of a little sweet treat, she would just take a teaspoon of honey. And she was always a proper weight and in good health. My mother's never had an operation. I mean, she's amazing. And so there must be something to that honey. And if she wanted to, she loved tea, hot tea. And she would sweeten it with a little honey. And so I just think of that. I think I look to my mom and what did she do? That she's lived so long and in good health. I look to her and what did she do? And so I keep a lot of honey now too. Molasses, I love molasses. I know that has a very strong flavor, but it is high in iron. My mother always put a teaspoon of molasses in milk when I was a little kid and would have me drink it. So I'm very accustomed to the flavor. I was even doing that as a young woman when I was a single girl on my own. A teaspoon of molasses in milk. It's very high in iron. It's got a lot of nutrition. Maple syrup, of course, we love that. A little maple syrup on our oatmeal. You can also get maple sugar. That's a little pricey, It does make a wonderful substitute. You won't get a strong maple flavor, but if you want to make like a yellow cake or one of the yellow cake mixes that I share with you, maple sugar works very well because it's light. And so it doesn't darken the color of the yellow cake. And I don't really pick up the maple flavor, so that's something worth experimenting with. You have date sugar, date syrup, coconut sugar. The selection of whole sweeteners that are available today is very wide, and you can definitely find something that is nutritious and that fits your budget. So as you're looking through the sweetener aisles, definitely look around at your choices. Think of what will do well in your working pantry, what will do well in your prepper pantry. And really, most of these are very shelf stable and are very, many would consider forever foods. Honey, I mean, didn't they find like honey in Egyptian tombs and whatnot, and it was still fine? And I mean, you hear about these things. But one thing I do want to mention, maple syrup does have a little more of a water content to it. So once maple syrup is opened, you should refrigerate it. However, I have had maple syrup in my prepper pantry for years, completely sealed. And when I've gone to open it and to use it, it's been fine. And then once I open it, then yes, I put it in my refrigerator. So as you're stocking up on these foods, look at the prices, look what's in your budget, what properties does it offer in terms of health benefits that are specific to you, what tastes are something that you enjoy. There's such a wide variety that you can often find something to fit both your budget and your tastes. And most of these, except for the unrefined whole cane sugar, most of these I usually do see in stock. So that's good. Alrighty, number 15 are wheat products. Now, it's interesting because we started with baking needs, where, as I shared with you, I just kind of hit on all the little things that one needs for baking. And now we're coming down to number 15, which ties right into number 1. Now, should you stock flour? And if you do stock flour, what type of flour is best to stock? And should you stock whole grains? And if you do stock whole grains, what can you do with them? I use the term wheat products loosely. Basically, what I'm talking about are whole grains. And the first one I really want to focus on, because this is probably one of the most easiest to find, and that's some type of oats. You can find oats as what are known as oat groats. That is the whole oat. You can find steel-cut oats. They're very common today. That is basically the oat groat that has been, as the name implies, steel-cut. It's just been cut up. And then you can also find old-fashioned rolled oats. So yes, they're instant oats and all of that, but I always recommend that to avoid those. They've just been a little too processed. When it comes to whole grains, the less processed, the better. So your best option, and often your best price, is going to find your grain in its whole form. And the nice thing about oats is that if you can find oat groats, whole oat groats, that is your best option to buy and store. If stored properly, they can stay fresh. And sometimes, I may give you shorter shelf lives than what some people may share with you. And so there are, often what I'll share with you are like the official, word on these things. However, I definitely agree with many of the other folks who consider these to have a much longer shelf life than what the packaging may say, or even such a shelf life to almost be considered a forever food. And whole grains are really in that category. Most whole grains can have a very long shelf life. And I would say easily you can, when properly stored, whole oat groats probably can be in your prepper pantry for 8 to 10 years. And wheat berries, things like that, maybe 25 years. So these are things that store very well. And oat groats, yes, you can soak them and sprout them, then dry them, turn them into oat flour. If you like if they're guaranteed to be gluten-free and you want some type of gluten-free flour, you can toast them and grind them in a little spice grinder, and then soak them overnight and make a wonderful oatmeal in the morning. I have a video where I show you how to do that. It's very easy to do, very nutritious. So that can be a very good place to start if you're new on this journey and you're saying to yourself, gee, I would like to stock whole grains, but I want to start with something that's easy and versatile. You can make oat groats. As I said, you can turn them into oatmeal. You can turn them into flour. You can even cook them as a savory dish the way you would like rice. So there's a lot you can do with oat groats. And as I said, after you toast them, you can whirl them in a spice grinder. You don't need anything special like a grain grinder. There's just a lot you can do with oats. And so I always say, and they're very affordable, which is wonderful. And they're very nutritious when properly prepared in the traditional manner through soaking and then cooking. Now, what about the other whole grains? Okay, let's talk about like wheat berries and then your ancient grains like spelt berries, which are your ancient wheats, einkorn berries, E-I-N-K-O-R-N. If you're new to einkorn, it's considered to be the original wheat. It's the truly ancient grain. So there are a lot of different options. You have barley. You have barley. I believe the whole barley is called barley groats. Rye. Sometimes you'll see whole rye referred to as berries. It used to be referred to as rye groats. But the bottom line is these are all in their whole form and can be stored for very long. Now, what if you want to use them as flour? Yes, wheat berries, spelt berries, einkorn berries, rye berries, whatever the case may be, yes, you'll need some type of grain grinder. You can definitely, or grain mill, you can use a manual one. I have one of those. They're relatively affordable. If you decide to go the manual route, try to use a flywheel because it's a little easier than the crank. But I also, after doing a lot of research, and I know I've shared this with all of you before, I decided to buy a mock mill. And I just bought their 100, their small one, and it's great for our family size. I love it. It's a stone grinding grain mill, and it's made in Germany. It's, I believe, beautifully made grain mill, and I'm so happy with it, and it's very affordable. And as I said, I bought that. I did research and bought that with my own money, and I was so happy with it that I contacted the mock mill company, and I said, could you give me a discount coupon code for my viewers, because I love your mill and I'd love them to be able to have one too if they wanted to buy one, but to get a little discount. So they did give me a discount. Again, I'll link to that shopping guide over on my website. So if that's something, if you're in the market for a grain mill, definitely consider the mock mill. But in any event, so you can soak any of these grains, you can sprout them, you can dry them, and then you can grind them if you like to make sprouted flour, to make those like Ezekiel type breads, or you can just grind them as is once you get a grain mill. And then you can, and also too, if you have one of those high-speed blenders, some of them do offer a particular type of canister to use to grind grain. But my friend I have a girlfriend who has one of those high-speed blenders, and she recommends freezing the grain before you grind it to keep it on the cooler side, because it can get a little overheated. And the problem is you never want to overheat your grain. That's why the stone grinding mills are very popular, because they're very gentle at preserving and protecting the oils that are naturally occurring in grain. You don't want to make them rancid at high temperatures when you're grinding them. So that said, keep that in mind in the back of your mind if you use a high-speed blender to grind your grain. But if you just want to grind your grain as is, definitely you can use that to make your sourdough starter, to make sourdough bread, and these would be like whole grain versions. If you wanted, you could sift out some of the bran and the germ. It's easy to do. I have a lot of videos where I show you how to do all of this. You just get a little sifter. They're very inexpensive. You put your freshly ground flour in there. You just shake it back and forth, and it'll keep, depending on the extent of the mesh. These baker's sifters come in different meshes, like a 40, 50, so they're numbered, and that number indicates the extent at which it will sift out the bran and the germ. And then you just sift it out, and then you can sift it to the point where you are making something close to an all-purpose or bread flour, or you can sift it just to the point where you get about 25% of the bran and the germ out, which is about what I like, because that allows you to do something that's very similar to what traditional cultures did. Bakers, even back in the Middle Ages, knew that if they sifted out a little bit of the bran and the germ, they'd get a lighter, tastier loaf of bread. But at the same time, it's very nutritious because it's still 3/4 of the flour contains all of the nutrients, the bran and the germ. But what people found was they were also digesting the bread easier because the bran and the germ do have, specifically the bran, has more of the phytic acid. So by sifting out some of that, you're sifting out some of the phytic acid, and you're also allowing yourself to make a lighter loaf of bread. Plus, if you use it to make your sourdough bread, by souring it, you're also helping to reduce some of the phytic acid. So you're making a very nutritious and delicious bread. And I have to tell you that if you have never ground your own grain, you are going to be so impressed with how fantastic it smells, how fresh it is, and what a wonderful loaf of bread it makes. Also, using freshly milled grain is a boon to making a sourdough starter. If you've ever struggled with making a sourdough starter in the past, using fresh milled flour really can help give you a boost to being very successful at making your sourdough starter. So when you're shopping and you can find whole grains, and more grocery stores, especially as they get back to selling more foods in bulk, it's getting easier to find whole grains in bulk. Do many specialty grocery stores sell them? Definitely. Are they always available online? Definitely. Sometimes they are out of stock. As I said, this whole process after 2020 of people wanting to be prepared, there sometimes are shortages. We find that sometimes things are out of stock. But just compare prices, think of which whole grains you want to stock, which whole grains are you going to use. Keep in mind that even if you have wheat berries, even if you have spelt berries, einkorn berries, rye berries, they can also be cooked just like rice, just like the oat groats, and make a savory side dish. Many traditional cultures have done this. So there's so much you can do with whole grains, and you can store them, and you can store them for a long time and keep them fresh for a long time when stored properly. Now, let's talk about flour. Should you be stocking flour? When it comes to flour, you want to focus on the flour that you buy at the grocery store or in bulk, wherever you buy it, that has had the bran and the germ removed. And the reason is all-purpose flour or plain flour or white flour, whatever you may know it as, is going to be much more shelf-stable than whole grain flour. Like, for example, whole wheat flour at your grocery store. You really want to try to use whole wheat flour, in my humble opinion, within 6 months. Some people will say a year. The packaging may even say a year. But you have to be careful, because whole grain flours can begin to go rancid because the oils are still intact, and it can take on an off odor. Versus all-purpose or bread flour that's had all the bran and the germ sifted out, and they've done it very professionally. So it really has had all the bran and the germ sifted out, versus what you might be able to make close, but not perfect, to an all-purpose flour at home, sifting it yourself. But the all-purpose and the bread flour are going to have a much longer shelf life. I think just as is in the package, the way you bring it home from the grocery store, it can probably stay fresh for about 2 years. If you store it even better than that, in an airtight container or airtight packaging. I met a lady, I think I was at Costco or Sam's one day, and she was telling me that she breaks her flour up, like she'll get a big 10-pound bag or something at one of the, big box stores like we were at. She'll pack it down into smaller amounts in a paper bag. Then she'll put it in the plastic, because she doesn't want the plastic to touch the flour. She'll put the paper bag into the plastic food saver bag and then seal it up. She's opened them 5 years later, and she says, it's great, no off odor, nothing. So there's so much that you can do to preserve the shelf life of your flours if you're buying all-purpose flour and if you're buying bread flour. And these are both great flours that you can still use to make your sourdough starter. They're wonderful for using to make sourdough bread. So I don't want you to worry about the nutrition factor, because these flours do serve a point in our traditional foods kitchen. And when you're turning them into sourdough bread, you're making them more nutritious. You're making the bread very digestible. So that's all things to think about. So be a little hesitant in terms of when you're thinking about your prepper pantry. Maybe okay for your working pantry for the whole grain flours, but stay on top of them, keep track of your inventory, and try to use those within the 6 months or year that you've purchased them. After that, they probably are not going to do as well if you had used them earlier. So stocking the whole grain over time as money allows, investing in a grain mill, and then on the other hand, when it comes to the flours, stocking the all-purpose flour and the bread flour. That is going to make for the perfect prepper pantry supply of food. Your whole grain, your all-purpose flour, and or your bread flour. Bread flour has a little more protein than all-purpose flour, and as the name implies, it can be very good for baking bread, versus all-purpose flour, which can be used for all-purpose cookies or quick breads, yeasted breads, whatever the case may be. So be sure to always be thinking in terms of what flours am I going to use, what timeline am I going to use these on, and what do I want to stock in my prepper pantry as backups. Now, if you would like to learn more about this whole prepper pantry journey, how to stock your prepper pantry right from day one, how to do it on $5 a week, how to store your food correctly, how to make meals with the food that you buy and keep in your prepper pantry so that nothing goes to waste, be sure to click on this playlist over here where I cover everything, soup to nuts, or should I say working pantry to prepper pantry. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.